My background is in election administration. So I started my career testing and certifying voting systems, and then moved to the Ohio Secretary of State's office under now Lieutenant Governor John Husted to help run elections in the state of Ohio. And then Speaker Boehner nominated me for a position on the Election Assistance Commission, where President Obama put my name forward and was confirmed by the Senate. And then moved over to the Department of Homeland Security under Director Chris Krebs to help protect the election from foreign interference, we thought, in working from 2018 to December of 2020. And so my appointments, my work was as a Republican, and you can imagine sitting here now as a Republican that works in the Trump administration protecting elections. It's been a hell of a few years for all of us. And so what I hope to do is use mis and disinformation, and specifically mis and disinformation around the election, to pull out or pull back and talk about what the Aspen Council recently called our digital information disorder, or our information ecosystem that's broken, right? We know the way that we consume information is leading to more extreme views, more extreme approaches, and certainly when it comes to our democracy, we know that mis and disinformation has broadened. In 2016, my work was focused mostly on Russia and China, to be honest. Coming out of 2016 into 2017, how do we combat both the cybersecurity, but also the mis and disinformation targeting elections? Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
They want to become a whole survey. Does it sound okay?
We want it so I'm only mildly yelling at you. That's...
So is there everybody?
Awesome. That's a good call, because I have no idea what I'm just yelling at people. So what I hope I can present to you is a case study using elections to talk about our information ecosystem and the disorder within it, to drive a conversation with you all about the steps we can take locally. And I've now worked not just on election mis and disinfo, but also vaccine mis and disinfo at Stanford Internet Observatory, researching vaccine hesitancy, mis and disinfo around anti-vaxxers and how that spreads. And not surprisingly, it's similar tactics, techniques, and strategies, right? So we'll talk about the importance of community. And part of the reason I want to thank my friend Andrew Shepardini, who I've known longer than either of us cares to admit, and we're much greater than we were when we met in high school. But I want to thank Andrew for pulling me in, because I honestly and truly believe, from working in this space now for a long time, that while there are policy strategies that we need to undertake, conversations about social media companies, information, the core of how we're going to combat this is not what I call the supply side, right, where social media companies and traditional media are feeding this and disinfo. It's on the demand side. Why are people requesting to receive this information? Why are we driving ourselves towards this? And how do we slow down or stop that consumption such that the demand wanes and we can deal more appropriately with the supply side? And it comes down to community. It comes down to trusted voices, trusted leaders within communities, talking openly and honestly with the folks that trust their voice about how they're consuming information and perhaps more productive approaches. So we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. Awesome. So just quick definitions, because you see the phrase misinformation, disinformation, even malinformation, which is beginning to creep in. It's a term actually that my agency has started using. And so it's important definitionally to lay this out. Misinformation is false, but not created or shared with the intention to harm. It's someone not knowing they're pushing incorrect information, right? So if we look at intent, misinformation, the intent isn't there to spread bad, false information. It's just they're unknowingly or unwittingly doing that. And what we see, obviously, is the next, disinformation, which is false information deliberately created to create confusion, doubt, whatever the case may be, comes about. And then those who don't know any better, those that don't know they're consuming bad or false information, push it. So you have a mixture of the disinformation driving the misinformation, right? But those definitions are important because it helps us understand the communities, the consumption of information, and who's really driving this. And we'll talk about sort of how this disinformation gets driven into a mis and disinformation environment and is exposed. And then there's malinformation, which is perhaps the most dangerous. And again, it's sort of a newer term, but it's based on fact. It's got nuggets of correct or true information, but it's used either out of context to mislead, harm, or create that distrust. So it's sewn in with either incorrect innuendo or statements to drive people towards more harmful or incorrect information. And malinformation, frankly, is a classic Russian tactic, right? Where they'll use bits of truth sprinkled in with their own perception of that reality in order to drive people towards improper conclusions. So I think those definitions are really important as we talk about this because they all get thrown around a lot of time. So I wanted to start there. Next slide, please. The key to understanding this problem is the participatory nature. And this has been true over since the dawn of time, right? The spread of gossip, the spread of conspiracy, the spread of lies comes about because people are willing to spread it, right? If one person tells a lie that no one else believes or is willing to spread, it stops with that person, right? The unique nature that we sit in now and have been for a while, quite frankly, is the speed at which this information can now be spread, right? The participation is global, the participation is widespread and shared, and we sectored ourselves into virtual communities that allow us to share this information rapidly with each other with our own opinions in order to drive it. And so understanding the participatory nature of mis and disinformation is really critical because you all, as leaders within your communities, have the ability to shape that participation, right? How do we drive people to either slow down on sharing this information, to think twice about sharing this information, to pull back and say, no, you know, I talked to Andrew, I'm going to keep using you just because I know you're welcome. I talked to Andrew about this, and I know I've heard something else here, and so maybe I shouldn't share it, right? So slowing down the consumption, slowing down the sharing, lessening that participation is part of the strategy here. And we know trusted voices within communities, individual conversations with people we believe in and trust is really critical to beginning to deal with what I view as a generational problem. This isn't something we can just wipe away with one policy decision. There are important policy decisions to be made, but this is something we've got to drive to as a community to begin to engage. So the participatory nature is really, really important. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a product that we created at CISA that was targeted to, and I'm sorry, it's a little blurry just being up there, but I'll walk through it real quick. We affectionately called it the pineapple product, and it was intended to capture actually Russian mis and disinformation techniques around the 2016 election, but you could remove foreign from this, you could remove Russian actors, and just call it a mis and disinformation, understanding mis and disinformation and the spread of mis and disinformation. How many of you like pineapple on your pizza? Okay, you're the reason our democracy is suffering. The correct answer is pineapple on pizza is disgusting and does not belong. No, we created this because we found an issue that was divisive, pineapple on pizza, that wasn't political, and we wanted to use it as a case study to show the spread of mis and disinformation. And we kind of fell into this because anybody that knows me knows I immediately turned to food conversation in any conversation, and those of us at CISA started arguing about pineapple on pizza. So if you look at sort of the steps of mis and disinfo, and I won't read through each one of them, you understand the strategy, what we call the tactics and techniques, right? First is finding the divisive issues. So in 2016, we know that the Russians targeted things like guns, things like LGBTQ plus issues, racial issues, white supremacy issues, and would literally seed these issues within the conversation of Americans on social media platforms to drive towards each other, right? So it starts by identifying those issues and then moves to getting accounts in place. How do we set up Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, Getter accounts now, right? In order to have in position the kind of amplification we need to drive these narratives, we then amplify and distort the conversation. We target people with messaging that gets emotions raised. We either want to make them laugh, cry, or get angry, right? In order to respond and drive them to hit that share button or that tweet button or whatever the case may be, in order to get their participation in the conversation. And then we try to drive it to the mainstream. So you can bubble something up to make it go viral, right? Then mainstream media, whatever that means, That can be, quasi-media outlets like Newsmax, that can be mainstream media like our traditional news outlets, begin to pick up on it. And they may report it in different ways, but the fact is they're amplifying it by talking about it, right? It becomes an issue that they've got to dive in on because it's newsworthy now, right? It's raised itself to newsworthiness. And then they take that conversation that now is showing up not just on social media channels or in individual chats, it's showing up in other media outlets, and they drive it into the real world. They ask you to take action. The best example for the 2016 election is literally the Russians got Americans to organize counter protests against each other in the same cities, right? Take it to the real world, take action on this, give us money, go take to the streets and protest, show up and have picket signs, whatever the case may be, but let's move this into the real world, into real world action. And there's an additional step now that we've seen since 2020. And that is, once you get people to take action, to demand that something be done about this issue that I've made you angry about, you then turn around and use their anger to justify your own policy positions. So you turn around and you say, look, millions of Americans are concerned about election integrity. We have to do something about this. Well, millions of Americans are concerned about election integrity because you and other blue check marks have driven a narrative to them that they should be concerned about election integrity because the process is rigged, the process is this, the process is that, and therefore now you justify your own policy positions. And we see that, I use it in election contests, but we've seen that around vaccines and vaccine hesitancy and policy positions around masks. It is not unique to elections, it is not unique to the right, but that's what we're prevalently seeing it right now. And so that 6 points is really important because that ability to intervene before policy decisions are made through your all's leadership, through your all's voices in your communities, through rallying the troops to say, you created this narrative to justify these policies is really critically important. And the most important thing we can see in this is seeing bipartisan support to speak out against that, right? So we saw last night, for instance, Liz Cheney speaking out, holding a press conference around it. That voice mattered. Whether or not you agree with Liz Cheney on policy issues or not, her voice matters in that context to the people she's talking to, right? Next slide, please. So this is part of the beginning of the case study around the election. So if we just kind of look at the time period leading up to the election, it gives us a really good outline of what a typical mis or disinformation campaign or propaganda campaign may look like. And it starts out before the election with generalized themes. Some examples are mail ballots are fraudulent. China can send in mail ballots. We should be worried about the vote counting after the fact. Generalized themes, not targeted on any individual locations yet, just generalized themes of integrity, of fraud, of cyber interference, using things like fear of China, fear of Iran, racial tensions, and utilizing racial tensions to divide, but not hunting on one area. We even saw on the left a mis or disinformation campaign that got quite a bit of play around Ivanka Trump owning patent interests in voting systems, and she was going to rig the election using these ways. So these exist, right? These spread, these get pushed in order to drive narratives, but they're not who did. As we get closer to the date, we begin to identify places that have had problems, right? We have early voting, we have voter registration deadlines, we have things like that allow those narratives to begin to centralize, to begin to combine with each other to drive narratives, and to do exactly what we saw in that chart, which is to seed the accounts and the narratives, right? In this case, a lot of blue check marks, a lot of folks in and around the former president's orbit talking about this. And then as we move on election day through, one, we know where the places that were problems. The easiest example is Antrim County, Michigan had the issue with the database. Antrim County is a tiny county in Michigan that was used as a focal point to claim that all Dominion voting systems were rigged. So we take a problem in a county and say it applies across the board. Anywhere they use Dominion voting systems, we know this algorithm is spiking, they're leveraging this, and so we use individual cases in order to drive those narratives, right? So you can take from the real world, and we'll talk about how those narratives get seeded and spread because there's two different approaches. Next slide. So top down versus bottom up. And as we look at sort of how the narratives in the case of the election, but again, the vaccine hesitancy, the same applies. Top down is the driving of narratives through large accounts or media, right? So before the election, lots of blue check marks, influential people talking about how mail ballots can't be trusted, that that this can be rigged, they can mail them in from everywhere, driving narratives down to their followers, down to those who listen and trust and respect them, to ask them to then begin looking for those things, right? So you send out kind of a call, you say, these are narratives that are going on, and then what happens, because it's participatory, is people ingest it into their own community to say, okay, what am I seeing in my community that drives this? What am I seeing that justifies this narrative? And so you see the replies that say, yeah, my aunt got 5 ballots, that's clearly a sign. Or this makes me sound so old, but which singer was it that claimed that they had a nephew who was in Costa Rica or something that had a reaction to the vaccine? It was either Cardi B or someone like Nicki Minaj. Thank you, Nicki Minaj. I'm so old. Like that was an old man's moment for me. That's terrible. It's on video. It's awful. But Nicki Minaj, right, taking a one-off experience that I think I heard to drive the narrative, to justify what I'm hearing. You see that over and over again, and what happens is the big accounts then go bottom up. They start pulling those narratives up into their own narratives to say, see, I told you Maricopa County is an example. I told you Las Vegas, Nevada is an example. We're hearing from people on the ground that are telling us this. So they pull those back up, and you see a bottom-up narrative where individuals' experiences are collected together to combine conspiracies together to justify the narratives that they're pushing that then go viral. And we'll use a specific example here to show how that works. So next slide. Okay, so Sharpie, how many are familiar with Sharpiegate? Hashtag Sharpiegate. Anyone? 1, I would expect you to be. 2, okay. So Sharpiegate emerged out of Arizona, where there were concerns about the use of Sharpies to mark ballots that would invalidate votes, okay? And Maricopa County uses Sharpies to mark their ballots because that's what the vendor recommends to Dominion voting systems in order to ensure that their intent is captured. They actually have a patented process that ensures that the bleed-through doesn't impact your vote. So they've created a way to do this. So the first signs we saw at Stanford of Sharpiegate were in this tweet, very small. You can see about when we pulled it, about 3 quote tweets, 4 retweets, kind of showing some concern and asking a question. This is something election officials encounter through every election every day. I'm worried about this. My ballot came like this. Can you explain to me how this works? Next slide, please. So Maricopa responds, as most election offices would. Hey, no problem. You're supposed to be using Sharpies. It's correct. That's what we use here in Maricopa County. They responded quickly, thought, okay, we've answered another voter's questions, on with our day. Next slide, please. But due to the participatory nature, the concerns about the election process, the seeding that had already taken place about concerns of the integrity of the election, those little individual one-off tweets came up in the bottom when people started to say, yeah, I'm worried about that too. Yeah, I actually used a ballot in Maricopa County. You can see it bled through. Did my vote count? And this is what we see. Questions raised, concerns with, and these are legitimate concerns from voters, right? A voter doesn't know how a voting machine works. They don't know that there's a patented process. Of course they see the bleed through and get worried about it, right? And Maricopa is trying to respond to this, but the concern then jumps to suspicion, right? So those narratives that have already been planted in folks' thoughts, they go, wait a minute, there's something more at play here, right? I'm part of this group that they don't want either participating or their votes counting, and therefore they clearly have set this up so that my vote won't count. So you move into suspicion where they say, our ballot had Sharpies to mark our ballots, they all bled through, we all complained, and no one wanted to do anything about it. Well, they didn't do anything about it because they wanted them using the Sharpies, right? They said, yeah, this is the writing implement you should be using. But when you see it through the lens of suspicion, when you've been told over and over again to look for these things, you begin to see more there than is actually there, right? And again, they don't understand, nor should they understand the whole details of how the system works. Next slide, please. Then suspicion becomes accusation. And what you see is blue check marks grabbing on to an individual narrative, pulling it up into their ecosystem in order to suggest that you're right. Your suspicions are confirmed. People from across the United States have sent me these ballots. This bleed through is a thing, and it's targeted in this case at Republicans, right? That their vote won't count, that they're intentionally being disenfranchised or invalidated, as you see here, for a huge number. And so what this does is twofold. It confirms the individual bottom-up suspicions, and 2, it drives more people to begin looking, right? It says, yes, go find this. You're right to be worried about this. There's something more going on here. So next slide, please. And so they start to look. So this is a screenshot of the Arizona Secretary of State's website that does ballot tracking. So Hamilton County has this, by the way. Sherry Cohen in Hamilton County, one of the best election officials in the country. We're lucky to have her here in Hamilton County, Ohio. But we have ballot tracking. And what you see in the ballot tracking system is that if you go vote in person in Arizona after you've received a mail ballot, they cancel your mail ballot so that they don't count it twice. Right? And so what they're telling you is this person went and voted in person, so we canceled your mail ballot. Well, this screenshot's taken and shared hundreds or thousands. You see, let's see here, 14,000 likes, 1.5 thousand quote tweets, 10,000 retweets, saying proof they canceled our ballots. It says right here, cancel. You can't trust this. We told you that this was going to happen. And honestly, I get it. It says canceled on the screen, right? You're sitting there going, what does that mean? Why does it show my ballot canceled, right? But the reality is they were canceling the mail ballot. But when you already have questions, suspicion, accusation in play, simple things like this go viral. They drive a narrative into jurisdictions, into conversations, into communities that don't even have these voting systems. In some cases, don't even have mail ballots. And in many cases, don't use Sharpies. And they're all having to answer questions about this because we've gone viral, it crosses borders, and it drives this conversation. Next slide, please. So if you look, this is a chart just on Twitter of the term Sharpie on Twitter and how it took off. So if you look over time, you can see where the sort of bluish boxes, that's when Maricopa County responded. That's when Maricopa County said, nope, nothing to worry about here. And it stayed kind of calm for a little bit. But then as soon as you see the first influencer accounts, so the circles, the diamonds, represent either retweets or shares by large accounts. The larger the circle or diamond, the larger the account. You see those first couple influencer accounts grab it, and up we go, it goes viral. And that's exactly what something going viral looks like, right? It starts off local, it starts off little, and as soon as the larger account grabs it, it has the potential to take off. As soon as that happens, Maricopa County, the Arizona Secretary of State, any election official in the country doesn't have a microphone loud enough to push back, right? They're not loud enough. They don't have enough followers. And so they've got to rely on others, hopefully, to share the truth, to push out on their accounts the truth. And we didn't see that in many cases, which is part of the conversation. Here, next slide. So we just kind of look at the power of sharing. This is a capture that we have from Stanford of repeat spreaders of information. So people that share mis or disinfo on a regular basis or repeatedly. And what you see with regard to just the election is obviously on the right, a large amount of resharing. But you can see on the left that there was activity, that there's this potential for narratives to take off and be shared through repeat spreaders and accounts, right? And so you see that across multiple platforms. And one of the dynamics we saw in this election that makes this particularly pervasive is Twitter or Facebook can take action against any one of these. So for instance, Twitter action Sharpie, they took down Sharpie references. But people had already screenshot it, so then it started showing up on Instagram and YouTube posts and shares on other platforms, such that even if Twitter actions it, the screenshot stays alive, the narrative stays alive, the hashtag can persist unless there's some coordinated response against it. And that ability to reshare, to hit it over and over again, a narrative, particularly from large accounts, is particularly pervasive when we talk about attempts to drive something to go viral, right? They know this is the playbook, is to constantly have those accounts sharing narratives and concepts. And so part of what we have to do is recognize the nature of that and help to drive narratives before we hit this multiple spread, multiple share environment. I love questions. We can go with questions all day.
Yeah, you mentioned large accounts. Does that mean like a number of followers?
Yeah, great question. So generally, yes, number of followers, although sometimes it can just be, they can have, they're going to need to have thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers, but even if it's not the millions, if they're followed by other accounts that have huge numbers, right, that can also fall into that category. So you'll see, particularly in politics, a local elected official may not have that many followers, but they've got the right followers that drives to a larger audience that then get shared, right? We see that on both sides of the aisle with things kind of being pushed to the spread. Next slide, please.
So what's this lead to? What are the impacts? How do we get to the point, which we're going to hear about in a minute, that people get, their identities get tied into these narratives, that they're willing to spend time, their own time, investigating, sharing, spreading, right? That's time that people otherwise would have to do other things. Why do they get pulled in? And it's twofold. One is they begin to find identity online, right? We saw with the Stop the Steal movement, for instance, that individual Americans who had never looked into or cared about elections now are spending a ton of time digging, looking, and sharing. QAnon's another phenomenon, right, where you see people radicalized into those concepts because they're willing to spend their time and energy because they find an identity and connection to it that they otherwise didn't have, right? And so this becomes a cause for them to pursue and spread. And what it leads to is otherwise, people that we interact with every day, sharing narratives that are inherently racist, that are inherently anti-Semitic, that are inherently just kind of crazy, that you look at it on its face and you say, you think an Italian satellite was used to rig this election, right? And this was the thing Italy gave. The claim was Italian satellites were used to rig this election. But what had happened is over time, that suspicion became accusation, and that accusation was merged together into other things. If we look at George Soros and the ownership of voting systems, that is a conspiracy that has existed since I've been in elections, since 2005, around ownership interest, George Soros, and rigging the election. And it's ranged everything from ownership of Smartmatic, which is a voting system company, to Michelle Obama and George Soros' wife vacationing together in Barcelona and kind of deciding this is the thing they were going to do. And so there's no shortage of these narratives driving it. The dead dictator theory about Hugo Chavez, that's actually a really good example of malinformation. So in 2005, members of the Venezuelan government did have an ownership interest in a voting machine company that the U.S. government said you can't have it. You can't have it. Got to die by CFIUS, for those familiar, of course. And it wasn't Chavez himself, but that has persisted since 2005 in sort of the conspiracy ecosystem, and it finally got its breath of fresh air to come out into the light in 2020 in combination with these concepts of rigging and stealing the election. So well-meaning people begin to dedicate their time thinking that they found the cause that they can pursue in order to respond, and this is where you end up, right? You end up with shares and theories and conspiracies that drive that narrative in pursuit of that cause that they have identified. Next slide, please. Just quickly, I wanted to talk on, just very briefly, on foreign influence, because it was what we were worried about, but it is also important as we look at our adversaries are benefiting from the existence of these narratives, from the willingness of the American people to intake and share these narratives. And they recognized it in 2020 and just went completely overt with it. So instead of like 2016 with hidden bot accounts and things like that, they just drove narratives themselves that Americans were already sharing. And they didn't just target people on the right. They targeted civil rights communities, saying they don't want you to vote. People of color's votes aren't counted, right? This is all from Russian media. They talked about a slow coup, that this election was being used, that you can't trust democracy because this is what democracy looks like, and it's a slow takeover of the government by the deep state forces that you're hearing about, right? And so I raise this just to say that this isn't just in your community important, and this just isn't important to us as Americans sort of supporting our democracy. This is a national security issue. China, Russia, Iran are messaging to the world and to their own people, you cannot believe in democracy. It is not worth pursuing. Let it go, right? And that is bad. That is bad for all of us. Next slide, please. So what's this all lead to? Where does this end up for us, right? How do we sort of see this ending? This, I hope, leads into the next talk, I suspect, if I've done my job well, which is action, right? We talked about action, people taking action. So that's that final step in the disinformation landscape. January 6th is an example of that, right? That was an attempt to take action to stop the electoral vote count process to prevent the stealing of the election, but we also see it across things like public health officials being threatened on a daily basis. This is a story that runs almost every day, so in a newspaper somewhere. We see election officials, poll workers, election workers, and now even individual citizens being intimidated and threatened because somebody has to do something to stop this from happening. We see it in the rise of anti-Semitism and attacks against places of worship, right? We see this extremism rising and bubbling up. It's existed, but it's now got air and it's got more support because of the rise of this mis and disinformation, driving conversations about the failure of democracy, the failure to protect your vote, and the changing of America because of that, right? So we tie these narratives in together. It starts with concepts of protecting your own vote, then moves to concepts of protecting everyone else's vote, and then moves to concepts of protecting the country we know, right? Whatever that may mean, right? And spreading that mis and disinformation. Next slide. So a couple of things just to see about what we can do, what you can do as leaders within your community, which is what I think is so important. We know, particularly in vaccine research, that trusted voices within communities are the best response to vaccine hesitancy. The problem is it doesn't scale terribly well, right? Individual conversations don't, but we have seen success, for instance, in an effort in Black communities using hairdressers and barbers to talk to their clients about vaccine hesitancy. And it has had a very tangible impact in those communities because of the trusted voices within those conversations. We've seen the same within Latin American communities and leadership within their community. So we know that individual conversations, you all as trusted voices in your communities, have an incredibly important role to play to step up and share the information necessary to combat this mis and disinformation, to help people recognize the risk that it exists out there, to help slow their consumption of this information, whether that's reading beyond a headline or getting them to stop sharing, to take a pause, to take a step back. One of the sort of programs we talked about at CISA that I wish you would have gotten to was a program called We Need to Talk About, and it was based on the emails that all of us have gotten from like Uncle Henry or Aunt Sally, where you're like, why are you sending me this crazy this info? We need to talk about what you're doing, right? Why are you consuming this? Because almost every American has experienced that in way, shape, or form, unless you're the person sharing it, and then you're the one on the bus that should look around and go, why am I sharing this? Thinking before you link and then talking to your circle is the most critical for you. Who is your circle of influence? Who can you talk to that leads to them talking, that leads to others talking, that begins to respond to this as a community, right? Because we know within communities that if you talk to your circle and that circle expands and expands, that narratives begin to take hold. And we can combat this. So these are just a few concepts. That's part of the conversation I want to have with you when we have a chance for questions and answers. But these are some of the concepts behind how we respond and combat some of this extreme thought going on. I think that's it.